Today, we are going to explore the fortresses that dominated the landscape of medieval Europe, structures of stone and engineering that represented absolute power in an era of constant conflict. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine a European landscape in the 9th century. The great Carolingian Empire, built under the vision of Carlos Magno, begins to crumble. The unity that had held together the lands we now know as France, Germany, northern Italy, and parts of Eastern Europe dissolves like mist under the morning sun. Central power evaporates, and in its place emerges something completely different, a fragmentation of territories controlled by local lords, each struggling to maintain his authority over the lands he claimed as his own. It is in this scenario of instability that one of the most iconic structures in human history is born. Not as a monument of ostentation, but as a desperate response to a fundamental question. How do you protect what is yours when there is no longer anyone else to do it for you? The first feudal lords faced threats coming from all directions. From the east, the Magyars rode in devastating raids. From the south, Muslim forces pressed against the borders of Christendom. And from the north, the feared Vikings descended in their high-prowed ships, leaving a trail of destruction wherever they passed. There were no imperial armies to call upon, no centralized forces ready to defend the territories. Each nobleman was on his own. The initial solution was as simple as it was ingenious. The first European castles, built from the 10th century onwards, followed a design known as motte and bailey. It was a relatively modest construction, an artificially raised mound of earth called a motte, upon which a wooden tower was erected. Around and below this elevation, a courtyard, the bailey, surrounded by a palisade of logs, offered space for residents, animals, and basic supplies. These primitive structures could be built quickly, sometimes in a matter of weeks. Wood was available in abundance in the European forests, and servile labor ensured enough arms to raise the mounds of earth. When a threat approached, the local population could take refuge in the enclosed courtyard, and if the situation became desperate, the defenders could retreat to the elevated tower, burning the bridges or ladders behind them. However, wood brought with it a fatal vulnerability. Fire was a constant enemy of these early fortifications, and attackers soon learned that incendiary arrows could do the work that a direct assault could not. Furthermore, wood rotted and simply could not withstand the increasingly heavy projectiles used in sieges. The transformation came gradually, driven as much by necessity as by the availability of resources. Wealthier lords began to replace their wooden palisades with stone walls. The central towers were rebuilt in robust masonry. This process of petrification, as some historians call it, did not happen overnight. In many cases, it took generations for a wooden castle to be completely transformed into a stone fortress. The Norman builders of the 11th and early 12th centuries were particularly influential in this evolution. When Guilherme the Conquistador invaded England in 1066, he brought with him not only warriors, but also a tradition of castle building that would transform the British landscape. The Normans built to intimidate as much as to defend. Their massive central towers, known as donjons, dominated the horizon as declarations of incontestable power. The donjon represented the heart of the Norman castle. It was simultaneously the lord's residence, the administrative center of the fief, the storehouse of wealth, and the last refuge in case of a siege. Its walls could be more than 3 meters thick, at the base tapering slightly as they rose. The windows were narrow and positioned high above the ground, making climbing practically impossible. The entrance to the donjon was normally on the first floor, accessible only by an external staircase that could be destroyed or retracted in emergencies. Some donjons featured an additional structure protecting this entrance, a kind of fortified forebuilding where any attacker who managed to get that far would still have to face more reinforced doors and well-positioned defenders before penetrating the main building. Inside, the floors were stacked in a logic that combined practicality with security. The lowest level, often semi-buried, served as a storehouse for grain, wine, salted meat, and other supplies necessary to survive a long siege. Some donjons had their own wells at this level, ensuring access to fresh water even when completely isolated from the outside world. Above the storage area was the Great Hall, the space of greatest social importance in the castle. There the lord conducted his business, received homage from his vassals, administered justice over his subjects, and organized banquets for allies and guests of honor. It was a space designed to impress as much as to function, with high ceilings, massive fireplaces, and, in more elaborate castles, decoration that reflected the owner's wealth and taste. The upper floors housed the private quarters of the lordly family. The solar, as the main room was called, offered a degree of comfort and privacy rare in the medieval era. There were also rooms for important guests, private chapels where the family could attend religious services without mixing with the servants, and the garderobes, small compartments that served simultaneously as closets and primitive toilets. The stairs connecting these levels were designed with defense in mind. In most donjons, they spiraled clockwise as they went up. This seemingly arbitrary choice had a precise military reason. A defender coming down the stairs, presumably right-handed like the majority of the population, would have his sword arm free to strike, while an attacker coming up would find his weapon constantly blocked by the central column. It was a small but potentially decisive advantage in the hand-to-hand combat that characterized medieval warfare. At the top of the donjon, battlements and walkways offered the last line of defense, as well as incomparable observation points over the surrounding territories. From there, sentinels could spot hostile approaches hours in advance, giving residents time to prepare for combat or seek refuge within the walls. However, the isolated donjon soon proved insufficient in the face of increasingly sophisticated siege tactics. Attackers of the 12th century already employed a variety of war machines capable of causing significant damage even to solid stone structures. Battering rams, protected by wooden covers, could repeatedly strike against doors and walls until they gave way. Siege towers allowed attackers to scale walls without the vulnerability of simple ladders, and catapults of various designs hurled heavy stones that cracked and eventually demolished even thick walls. Even more insidious was the technique of mining. Siege engineers dug tunnels under the foundations of the walls, propping them up with wooden beams. When the tunnel reached far enough, the beams were set on fire. The collapse dragged the wall above down with it, opening breaches through which attackers could advance. The response of the castle builders was to add layers of defense. If a single wall could be breached, two walls would make the task much harder. If one gate could be knocked down, multiple gates in series would transform each conquest into a new battle. This reasoning led to the development of the concentric castle, the most sophisticated and formidable form of medieval fortification. The concentric castle abandoned the model of a single defense to embrace a concept of defensive depth. Layer after layer of obstacles stood between the attacker and the heart of the fortress. Each layer was designed not only to resist, but to expose invaders to fire from defenders positioned on the innermost and highest layers. The first obstacle an enemy army would encounter was the barbican, an advanced defensive structure positioned even before the main entrance of the castle. It functioned as a kind of fortified antechamber, a vestibule of death where attackers were forced to crowd together under constant fire from the battlements above before having any chance of reaching the true gate. The barbican had its own walls, its own towers, its own battlements. Conquering it did not mean conquering the castle, only crossing the first of many defensive lines. And while the attackers focused on breaking through its defenses, the defenders on the main walls had clearly exposed targets for their arrows and projectiles. Beyond the barbican, the moat created a barrier that seemed simple, but presented enormous tactical challenges for any siege force. This large ditch, often filled with water, encircled the entire fortress like an impassable abyss. Siege towers could not cross it. Battering rams could not reach the walls without first building bridges or makeshift embankments. And the technique of mining became impossible when water-saturated soil entered any tunnel. The only passage over the moat was the drawbridge, a structure ingeniously designed to be as useful in times of peace as it was useless to enemies in times of war. In its most basic form, It was a reinforced wooden platform, hinged at one end next to the castle entrance. Chains attached to the outer end ran through pulleys to an internal mechanism, operated by guards on the upper floor of the entrance. When raised, the bridge transformed into yet another vertical barrier covering the entrance, while the moat below prevented any approach. Larger and heavier bridges required counterweight systems to assist in lifting, and some more elaborate designs included pits or traps in the path, ensuring that even if attackers managed to cross a lowered bridge, they would still find unpleasant surprises waiting. Crossing the bridge, attackers would enter the passage of the main entrance, a structure known as the gatehouse. This was not a simple portal, but rather a fortress within the fortress, specifically designed to turn the most obvious entry point into a death trap. The first obstacle would be the gate itself, massive and reinforced with iron. Even under constant battering ram attack, a well-built gate could resist for hours or days. From the inside, a thick wooden bar, fitted into cavities carved into the stone walls on both sides, prevented any external brute force from opening the doors. But even if the gate fell, the attackers would not find free passage. Ahead of them would descend the grid of iron and wood known as the portcullis. Running on vertical tracks carved into the stone, this heavy barrier could fall instantly, transforming from an open passage into an impassable obstacle in seconds. Sharp spikes at the base ensured that anyone caught underneath at the moment of closing would pay a terrible price. Systems of chains, pulleys, and counterweights allowed the portcullis to be operated quickly by a relatively small number of guards. In emergencies, a release mechanism could cause it to plummet under its own weight with devastating force. Some castles possessed 2 or more portcullises in series, creating entrapment zones between them. These entrapment zones represented perhaps the most sinister aspect of the gatehouse design. Imagine a group of attackers who managed to knock down the outer gate, only to find a portcullis blocking their progress. While they try to force their way through, the portcullis behind them descends, trapping them in a dead-end corridor. And then the holes in the ceiling begin to make sense. The so-called murder holes allowed defenders on the upper floor to pour projectiles onto anyone trapped in the passage below. Stones, arrows, heavy objects of all kinds rained down on attackers who had nowhere to run. Some historical accounts mention the use of boiling oil or water, although these practices were probably less common than popular imagination suggests, given the cost and difficulty of keeping large quantities of hot liquids ready for use. Openings in the side walls completed the trap. Known as arrow slits, these narrow fissures allowed defenders to fire at point-blank range against anyone in the passage. Seen from the outside, they were almost invisible, but from the inside, they offered devastating fields of fire. If they managed to cross this corridor of death and break through the internal defenses of the gatehouse, the attackers would emerge into the outer ward. This open space between the outer and inner walls might seem like a breather after the horror of the passage, but it represented another carefully designed trap. The outer ward was completely dominated by the inner walls, which rose higher and thicker than the outer ones. Defenders positioned on these upper walls had perfect firing angles over anyone in the ward below. There was no cover, no shelter. The attackers were exposed to arrows and projectiles coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Some gatehouses were built as half-towers, open at the rear. This design choice meant that even if attackers managed to take the structure, they could not use it as a defensive position against the castle's forces. Instead of a conquered bulwark, they would have only a trap, exposed to fire from the surrounding towers and walls. The base of the walls themselves received special treatment. The talus, a sloped section of stone at the base, served multiple defensive purposes. Battering rams hitting this angular surface would have part of their force deflected, reducing the impact against the main structure. Siege ladders leaned against the talus stood at unstable angles, more prone to slipping or breaking, and siege towers simply could not get their drawbridges to touch such an inclined surface. If the outer ward fell, the inner wall would still remain, a barrier even more formidable than the first. Higher, thicker, built with the same combination of outer stone and a core of rubble and mortar that had proven its effectiveness for centuries, This wall represented the penultimate line of defense. Towers projected at regular intervals along this wall. Their primary function was to allow flanking fire. Defenders could hit attackers trying to scale the wall between the towers, turning any climbing attempt into a suicidal proposition. Each tower was, essentially, a mini-fortress in itself, with multiple floors, its own defenses, and its own supplies. In some towers were armories, stores of weapons and equipment ready for rapid distribution. Others served as quarters for guards, ensuring that defenders were always available along the entire length of the wall. Some functioned as storehouses for food, ammunition, or construction materials for emergency repairs. Hidden at some point in the inner wall, there might be a secret gate, known as a postern. This discreet passage, often disguised or positioned in hard-to-reach locations, served crucial purposes during sieges. Messengers could slip out quietly to seek reinforcements. Scouts could return with information about enemy positions. And on some occasions, defensive forces used the postern to launch surprise counterattacks against unsuspecting besiegers. Crossing the inner wall, one finally reached the inner ward, the heart of the castle complex. This space, protected by the concentric layers of defense around it, was where daily life happened, even during times of peace. Stables housed horses essential for transport, communication, and mounted combat. Workshops for blacksmiths, carpenters, and other artisans maintained weapons, armor, and the castle structure itself in working order. Kitchens stored and prepared food for the entire garrison. A chapel offered space for the religious observances that permeated medieval life. The presence of the well was absolutely critical. Without water, no fortress could resist for more than a few days. Castle builders invested considerable resources in locating and developing reliable water sources within the walls. Dominating the inner ward rose the central tower, the last and most powerful defense of the entire complex. By this point, defenders of a concentric castle under siege would have lost the barbican, crossed the moat somehow, faced the horrors of the gatehouse, fought for the outer ward, breached the inner wall and its towers, and finally reached this last refuge. The central tower needed to be able to resist even when everything else had fallen. The construction of the central tower reflected this responsibility. Walls of extraordinary thickness, reinforced at the corners by smaller towers that served as firing positions and observation points. Windows reduced to a minimum on the lower floors, practically non-existent except as narrow arrow slits. The elevated entrance, accessible only by external stairs that could be destroyed or retracted. If the central tower featured a forebuilding protecting its entrance, this structure represented yet another obstacle for attackers already exhausted by successive battles. Arrow slits in the walls allowed defenders to shoot at anyone on the access stairs. Some forebuildings included their own drawbridge and gate, miniaturizing on a smaller scale all the defenses that protected the main entrance of the castle. Inside the central tower, the vertical organization combined practical needs with defensive concerns. The basement stored the supplies necessary to withstand a prolonged siege, grains that could last for months if well stored, salted and smoked meats, barrels of wine and beer. If the tower had its own well, the defenders could theoretically hold out indefinitely, limited only by their food supplies. The Great Hall occupied 1 or 2 floors, serving the same ceremonial and administrative functions it performed in older fortresses. The upper floors housed the private quarters, guest rooms, private chapel, and garderobes. And at the top, the battlements offered the final view over a battlefield that, by this point, would be covered by the debris of resistance. The increasing sophistication of medieval castles represented an architectural arms race waged over centuries. Each new siege technique eventually found its defensive countermeasure, and each new defense was eventually overcome by more elaborate tactics. This cycle of innovation produced fortresses of impressive complexity, but it also led to their eventual obsolescence. The change came not from a more elaborate siege tactic, but from a completely new technology, gunpowder. The first cannons to appear on European battlefields in the 14th century were primitive, inaccurate, and often more dangerous to their operators than to their targets. But the technology evolved rapidly. In the 15th century, gunpowder artillery had reached a level of power and precision that rendered centuries of defensive engineering obsolete. Stone walls that had resisted generations of conventional sieges crumbled under the sustained bombardment of cannons. Towers that had dominated landscapes for decades were reduced to rubble in a matter of hours. The height that had been an advantage became a vulnerability, offering larger targets for increasingly skilled gunners. The initial response of fortification builders was simply to increase the thickness of the walls, but this solution soon proved impractical. The amount of stone required to resist modern bombardment made construction economically unviable and strategically questionable. The time needed to erect such fortifications exceeded any reasonable military campaign schedule. The solution came in the form of a complete redesign of defensive architecture. The artillery forts that replaced medieval castles abandoned height in favor of low, angled profiles. Sloping walls deflected projectiles instead of absorbing their impact. Projecting bastions allowed crossfire over any point of approach. These new fortifications were built exclusively for war, without any pretense of serving as residences. The nobility, deprived of their castles as symbols of military power, turned to the construction of palaces and mansions, structures designed to impress through beauty and luxury instead of intimidating through defensive imposition. The castle as a lordly residence and military fortress disappeared, replaced by specialization in purely residential or purely military constructions. Some castles survived the transition, transformed into comfortable residences through renovations. Others were abandoned as their owners moved to new palaces. Many were deliberately destroyed during conflicts or simply stripped of their stones for use in other constructions. Those that survived, intact, often found new purposes completely distant from their original function. Some were converted into prisons, others became administrative headquarters, archives, or government storehouses. A few remained as residences for noble families who maintained their titles and properties through the political upheavals of the following centuries. Today, surviving medieval castles attract millions of visitors annually. Tourists walk along walkways where guards made their rounds centuries ago. Children imagine knights and princesses in spaces that originally housed realities much more complex and often violent. Beyond their tourist appeal, these stone monuments offer irreplaceable windows into understanding medieval society. Every aspect of their construction reflects choices made by people facing specific problems of their time. The thickness of a wall tells stories of perceived threats. The position of an arrow slit reveals long-abandoned military tactics. The layout of a great hall demonstrates social hierarchies that shaped lives centuries ago. Castles remind us that history is not just about events and characters, but also about the physical spaces where life happened. These structures were not just settings for historical dramas, but active participants shaping how events could unfold. A siege waged against a well-built castle differed fundamentally from an attack against poorly designed fortifications. The defense of a territory depended as much on the engineering of its fortresses as on the bravery of its defenders. And so, medieval castles remain as testimonies to an era when architecture was literally a matter of life or death. Their stone walls carry stories of sieges survived and battles lost. Their halls echoed with negotiations that shaped the fate of nations. Walking through their corridors today, we can almost feel the weight of that history in every stone positioned by hands long gone. If you have made it this far on this journey through medieval fortresses, you have already demonstrated the same investigative spirit that led the ancient builders to develop increasingly elaborate defenses. Just as they built layers of protection around their castles, you can help strengthen this channel by subscribing and leaving a comment about which aspect of medieval engineering most sparked your curiosity. Every like and every share helps take these stories from the past to more people in the present. And if you know someone fascinated by history and architecture, consider opening the doors of this knowledge to that person as well. After all, the best fortresses were always those built with the help of many hands working together.